The night is thick with silence, broken only by the distant toll of a church bell echoing through the damp air of the Tower of London. Shadows crawl across the stone walls like spectres from another world, and in those shadows sits a queen stripped of her crown, stripped of her dignity, and left with nothing but the cold certainty of death. Anne Boleyn, once the most powerful woman in England, once the hope of a dynasty, now waits for the blade that will end her life. History remembers her as ambitious, cunning, even dangerous. But what it often forgets is the suffocating fear that consumed her in her final hours. The corridors outside her chamber whisper with the footsteps of guards, each echoing step a cruel reminder that the world she once commanded is now ruled by silence and betrayal. Anne's body trembles not from the cold, but from the knowledge that at dawn she will walk barefoot onto the scaffold before a sea of watching eyes and kneel in the final act of submission. It is in these last hours that truth reveals itself. Not the truth of a queen's power, but the truth of her downfall. A fall designed not by justice, but by hatred, envy, and a world eager to destroy a woman who dared to challenge it. Her enemies painted her as a traitor, a witch, a seducer who brought shame to the throne. But behind the accusations lay something darker, a system designed to crush those who did not conform, those who refused to bow quietly, those whose very existence threatened the fragile balance of power, racism, class, and prejudice. In Tudor England, they took many forms. Anne, though English by birth, was marked by whispers of otherness. Her French upbringing, her sharp tongue, her refusal to be the silent, obedient wife. These became weapons in the hands of her enemies. She was a woman out of place in a world ruled by men, a voice out of tune in a chorus that demanded silence. And for that, she was condemned. As the candlelight flickers in her chamber, her thoughts drift not to glory or triumph, but to the cruelty of betrayal. Friends who once praised her now turn their faces away. Allies who swore loyalty now sharpen their knives in silence. Even the king, the man who once risked a kingdom for her, has traded passion for hatred, love for vengeance. The clock of fate ticks louder with every heartbeat. Soon the sun will rise, and with it, the executioner. The blade will fall, and history will carve her name in blood and fear. But before that moment arrives, there is the silence. A silence, heavy with dread, thick with unanswered questions. Why was Anne truly condemned? Was it treason, adultery, witchcraft? Or was it something far more sinister? Was she guilty of the crimes they hurled against her, or guilty only of being a woman who refused to bend, who dared to rise too high, too fast, in a world that punished those who dared to defy its chains? This is not just the story of a queen, it is the story of injustice, of prejudice, of the terrifying cost of standing apart in a society that demanded conformity. It is the story of a woman who died in fear, but whose death continues to whisper across centuries, reminding us that power is never safe and injustice is never silent. Her final days were not just the downfall of a queen, they were a chilling reflection of how societies destroy those they cannot control. And as the dawn breaks over the tower, we are forced to ask ourselves, how many Anne Boleyns has history buried in silence? The cold wind of an early dawn pressed heavily against the narrow streets, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke and damp earth. The town had not yet awakened, but its silence was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of fear, a silence that lingered in the crevices of old buildings, hidden between the cracked stones of forgotten alleyways, and whispered through the voices that dared not rise above a murmur. In this town, history did not live in the dusty books of libraries. It lived in the stares of strangers, in the tightening of jaws, in the way footsteps quickened when someone different walked by. Here, racism was not an open fire, but rather a smoldering coal, always ready to ignite. And yet, people carried on, pretending normalcy, burying the ugly truths in layers of routine. At the edge of this place lived a young soul, tired, wary, but not broken. Their house was no more than a shell of rotting wood, with broken shutters that clattered when the wind pressed too hard. It was here that mornings began with the same ritual: a slow rising from a bed that barely held together, a cautious glance at the window as though expecting to find eyes peering through, and a breath drawn deep enough to steel the heart against another day. Every object in that room told a story of survival. The faded blanket, patched in places where the cloth had torn, the cracked basin where water was kept because clean wells were not shared with them, the shoes, worn to their very last layer, but still carried forward because new ones were not meant for people like them. Poverty was not the curse alone. It was poverty enforced by prejudice, sharpened by the silent rules of a town that thrived on exclusion. The church bells tolled in the distance, slow, echoing, almost mournful. It was the signal that the rest of the town would soon rise. For the protagonist, it was also a warning. Be careful, keep your head down, survive quietly. The world had a way of reminding them that they were tolerated only as long as they did not disturb the order set by others. As footsteps echoed in the street below, the day began to reveal its cruel choreography. Shopkeepers arranging their stalls, but ensuring certain eyes never lingered too long. Neighbors exchanging pleasantries but lowering their voices when the other passed. Children taught by silence what words could not say. Our protagonist walked into this stage with a heart weighted by centuries of inherited scars. Their ancestors had known chains, humiliation, and the long march of injustice disguised as tradition. And though those times had changed in form, their essence had not vanished. Racism was no longer the whip in the open square. It was the thousand small cuts that left a person bleeding invisibly. The streets stretched forward like a labyrinth of both possibility and danger. For those born into privilege, it was a marketplace filled with opportunity. For those marked as different, it was a minefield, every corner hiding a reminder of their place. An old man spat near the cobblestones as they passed. His eyes did not meet theirs, yet his gesture spoke louder than words. A group of children, still innocent enough to be taught cruelty, whispered and laughed, pointing as though they had spotted a curiosity from a traveling circus. Every small act carried the weight of centuries. And yet, the protagonist walked on. The shoulders straightened, not out of pride, but out of defiance. The silence of survival had taught them resilience. The ground beneath their feet was unfriendly, but it had also given them an iron heart. Every insult, every stare, every denial of dignity, all had hardened them into something unbreakable, though the cracks ran deep within. At the marketplace, the cruel theatre of hierarchy played out daily. Stalls lined with bread and fruit seemed abundant, yet some coins were never accepted from certain hands. The butcher turned his back as though deaf when the protagonist asked for meat. The tailor's wife clutched her child's hand tighter, pulling them away as though danger had brushed too close. These were not accidents. They were rehearsed gestures, passed down from generation to generation, an inheritance of prejudice. No one ever said it openly. The cruelty lived in whispers, in the way doors shut quietly but firmly, in the way opportunities slipped from grasp without explanation. And the most terrifying part of it all was not the open hatred, but the suffocating normalcy of it. Racism had been woven so tightly into daily life that people did not even see it as cruelty anymore. To them, it was simply the way the world worked. By afternoon, the streets swelled with more bodies, and the lines of division grew clearer. Certain benches in the park were left empty when the wrong person sat on them. Certain wells dried up quicker, not because of lack of water, but because neighbors refused to share. Even laughter carried division, one kind that rang free and another that died quickly, suffocated by shame. The protagonist sat in the corner of this vast play, watching, breathing it all in. There was no escape, not yet, but within the depths of this quiet suffering, there was a spark, the beginning of a storm. For even the most oppressed hearts, when pressed against the wall too long, begin to beat louder. And though silence had been survival, silence could also become suffocation. The day closed under a sky stained with crimson, as if the heavens themselves wept for the weight carried on this land. But the night did not promise peace, for in the shadows, whispers grew louder. Something was building, something dangerous, inevitable. And in the stillness of that small, broken room, the protagonist knew their story was not destined to remain quiet forever. This was only the beginning. The town did not forget. That was its most dangerous trait. Every stone, every street corner, every cracked wall remembered the invisible lines drawn generations ago. Families passed down not just names and houses, but grudges, fears, and an unspoken handbook of who belonged where. The protagonist had been born into this, not into a neutral world, but into a map already drawn, their path already marked with boundaries they had never agreed to. Their earliest memories were not of lullabies or warmth, but of the stinging reality of difference. As a child, they had once reached for the same toy another child held at the marketplace. The mother of that child had pulled them away so quickly, so violently, as though poison had brushed against her son's skin. The look she gave was not fear, it was disgust. That look had stayed, carved into memory like a scar that never faded. It was not just the cruelty of strangers, it was the silence of neighbors too. Silence was louder than words. Silence when bullies pushed them into the mud. Silence when teachers overlooked raised hands in the classroom. Silence when doors closed just as they arrived. Silence was not neutral, it was complicit. Now grown, the protagonist carried the weight of those memories like chains disguised as shadows. They moved through the town with practiced caution, every step calculated, not because they feared for their life at every turn, but because they feared for their dignity, which was stolen piece by piece in small humiliations. On some days, dignity slipped quietly away in the form of being ignored at the market stall. On others, it was stripped away in harsher ways, whispers turning into insults, laughter turning into cruelty. And then there were days when the cruelty was not subtle at all. One evening, when the streets had emptied and the church bells had rung their final echo, the protagonist had walked home to find words scratched into the wooden door of their house. Crude, hateful words, carved deep enough that even the rain could not wash them away. No one claimed responsibility. No one had to. The whole town already knew who had written them, just as they knew no one would face consequences. The message was clear. You will never belong here. The walls of their small home carried these messages silently, absorbing them the way old wood absorbs dampness. Inside, survival looked simple, but every act was a battle. Fetching water from a well meant braving the stares of neighbors. Finding work meant being rejected before a single question was asked. Even resting meant listening for footsteps outside, because peace was fragile, temporary, easily broken by someone's anger. And yet, in this suffocating existence, there were small sparks of humanity that refused to die. Books, borrowed in secret from those few who dared to share, offered glimpses of other worlds where freedom and dignity were possible. The sky at night, vast and indifferent to human cruelty, whispered promises of something larger. And the heart itself, despite being bruised, still beat with a rhythm of resistance. The protagonist was not just a victim, they were a witness. They saw more clearly than those who lived in comfort. They understood the lies that the town told itself, that things were equal, that there was no injustice, that cruelty was just, the natural order. They knew better, and knowing was dangerous. As weeks passed, tension in the air grew thicker, though no one admitted it aloud. It was there in the way certain families locked their doors earlier than usual. It was there in the hurried steps of workers who avoided lingering in the streets after dark. It was there in the sharpness of conversations, words chosen with care, as though everyone knew something but dared not speak it. The protagonist felt it too. The cruelty of the past was heavy enough, but there was something different building. Now, something about to break. They felt it when they crossed the square and caught the gaze of townsfolk. colder, sharper, more hostile than before. They felt it in the nights when sleep came late because of the echo of laughter outside. Laughter that wasn't friendly but mocking, waiting. One afternoon, the protagonist walked past the schoolyard where children played. Their laughter filled the air, but it was not pure. The children had learned from their parents well. A ball rolled toward the protagonist's feet. When they bent down to return it, the children did not say thank you. Instead, one of them sneered and muttered a word too old for a child's mouth, but too familiar for the protagonist's ears. A word designed not just to insult, but to wound. The teacher, who stood nearby, heard it. But like all adults before, she turned her head, pretending not to notice. Silence, again. Silence that condoned. Silence that raised another generation to believe hatred was normal. The protagonist handed the ball back without a word, the muscles of their face frozen into stillness. But inside, something stirred. Not anger alone. Anger had long been present. It was something heavier, darker. The realization that the cruelty would not end by itself. That silence, both their own and others, was the very thing keeping the chains unbroken. That night, as the wind howled and rattled the loose shutters of their home, the protagonist sat awake, staring at the darkness. Their heart pounded, not from fear, but from an awakening. The kind of awakening that comes when years of suffering gather like a storm, pressing against the walls of the soul until the walls begin to crack. For years they had endured, survived, and kept their head down. But survival was no longer enough. Every insult, every denial, every scar carved into their memory demanded more. The protagonist did not know yet what form it would take, but they knew this much. Something was going to change. And the town, still sleeping in its ignorance, still blind in its cruelty, had no idea what was coming. This was the stillness before the storm. The setup had been written in silence, but soon silence would no longer be possible. The days blended into each other, each one an echo of the last, yet each carrying a slightly sharper edge. What had once been background noise of prejudice was now a steady drumbeat, louder and louder with every passing hour. The protagonist could feel it in the air like the scent of smoke before a fire. The streets, once merely cold and unwelcoming, now felt hostile in ways words could not capture. The stares lingered longer. Conversations stopped abruptly as they walked by, only to resume once they had passed, accompanied by muffled laughter or whispered curses. Even the children, those too young to understand the poison they carried, spat cruel words that had been fed to them at dinner tables. This was no longer simple dislike. It was preparation. The town was preparing itself for something darker, something collective. At home, the protagonist's solitude grew heavier. Their small house, once a fragile sanctuary, became a prison of silence. The walls, stained with smoke and age, seemed to lean closer each night, pressing inward as though they too wanted to crush what little hope remained inside. Every creak of the wooden floorboards reminded them of nights when footsteps outside had paused too long. Every flicker of candlelight cast shadows that stretched like claws. Survival no longer felt like simply enduring the present. It felt like anticipating an inevitable blow. The protagonist sat by the window on many nights, staring at the square in the distance. From that view, they could see the church tower standing proud, lit by moonlight, as if mocking them with its calm authority. That tower, that bell, that symbol of community, all of it belonged to others. They could never claim it. They could only watch from the edges, like a ghost haunting a town that had never wanted them alive in the first place. Yet, beneath this suffocation, a seed of defiance grew. It was small at first, a thought they dared not fully acknowledge. But thoughts are dangerous. They take root. And this one did. What if I stopped being silent? The question lingered in their mind, haunting them as much as the cruelty they endured. Silence had been survival. Silence had been protection. But silence had also been surrender. They remembered the night when their door had been carved with hate. They had scrubbed the words until their hands bled, hoping the wood would forget, but it never did. Even now, when their fingers brushed against that scar, they could feel the letters like burns against their skin. Silence had not erased them. Silence never erased anything. The protagonist's only friend in town, if one could call them that, was an old woman who lived at the edge of the marketplace. She was not kind in the way stories tell of gentle souls. She was sharp, bitter, but not blind. And perhaps that was her kindness. She saw, and she did not pretend otherwise. One evening, as the protagonist bought a piece of stale bread from her stall, the woman spoke in a hushed tone. "They're watching you more closely now," she said, her eyes darting around. "Keep your head down." The protagonist's chest tightened. "Keep your head down." The same words they had been told all their life. Advice, disguised as care, but really just another link in the chain. That night, the words echoed in their head until they twisted into something else. How long can a head stay bowed before it breaks? Tension turned into inevitability. One morning, when the protagonist stepped outside, they noticed something strange. The street was unusually quiet. The usual shuffle of workers, the distant hum of conversation, the barking of dogs, all gone. The silence was unnatural, heavy, deliberate. Then came the sound of footsteps, many of them. From the square, a group of men emerged, their faces hard, their eyes fixed. They did not speak. They did not need to. Their presence was enough. Behind them, others appeared, neighbors, townsfolk, even those who had once nodded politely in passing. They gathered like vultures circling. The protagonist's pulse quickened. This was not a chance encounter. This was not random cruelty. This was something else. Something planned. For hours after, the town pretended nothing had happened. The crowd dispersed slowly, deliberately, as though satisfied with the fear they had planted. No words were spoken, but the message was clear. We see you. We are waiting. The protagonist shut their door, bolted it, and leaned against it as their chest heaved. They had lived their entire life under the weight of prejudice. But this was different. This was not isolation anymore. It was the beginning of an assault. And in that suffocating silence, something inside them hardened. They could no longer afford to simply survive. The world outside may have been painted in cruelty, but inside their mind, images began to form. Images not of surrender, but of resistance. Every memory of humiliation, every whispered slur, every carved word in the wood became fuel. They were no longer just the victim of this town's hatred. They were the storm forming at its edges. The setup had reached its end. The stage was ready. The atmosphere poisoned. The lines drawn. The protagonist, once bowed by silence, now stood on the threshold of something larger, darker, inevitable. And as the night closed in, carrying the weight of centuries of injustice, one truth burned brighter than ever before. The town had underestimated the fire that grows in silence. The silence of the previous night never left. It clung to the streets, to the corners of the marketplace, to the windows of houses where curtains twitched as the protagonist walked past. This silence was not emptiness. It was pressure. It was the space before thunder, the held breath before a storm breaks. The protagonist felt it with every step. Their senses sharpened to the smallest sound. The scrape of boots on cobblestones, the snap of a shutter closing too quickly, the low mutter of voices cut short when they came within earshot. They had always been unwelcome, but now it was different. Now it felt as if the entire town had rehearsed a role, and every person was waiting for their cue. For years, hatred had existed in fragments. Insults muttered in alleys, stones thrown by children, shopkeepers refusing to serve. But fragments can sharpen into a blade. And now, that blade was being drawn. One morning, as the protagonist crossed the square, they found the church doors wide open. That was unusual. The church was always closed until the bells called the faithful. But today, the doors yawned open, revealing shadows within. A group of men lingered near the entrance, their voices low, their laughter sharp. The protagonist lowered their gaze and tried to pass, but one of the men stepped forward. His boots thudded against the stone, blocking the path. "You don't belong here," he muttered, his voice loud enough for others to hear. The others chuckled, circling like wolves testing their prey. No one moved to help. No one even looked away. The square had become a stage, and everyone had chosen their side. The protagonist's breath quickened, but they forced themselves to keep walking, edging around the man. For a moment they thought it was over, but as they turned the corner, something struck their back, a rock, thrown with deliberate force. The pain wasn't as sharp as the humiliation. Laughter erupted behind them, echoing through the empty streets long after the footsteps faded. That night, the protagonist sat in their home, trembling hands pressed against their knees. The wound on their back throbbed, but the wound in their spirit was worse. It wasn't just the stone that had struck. It was the silence of the bystanders, their neighbors, people they had nodded to for years, people who, in that moment, had chosen cruelty over humanity. Hatred had always been poisonous, but now it was spreading faster, infecting everything. They stared at the scarred wooden door of their home, the one still etched with cruel words. For so long they had believed that door kept them safe, that the bolts and locks were enough to protect them. But now they saw it for what it was, a thin barrier against a hatred that was growing stronger by the day. The next day, things escalated. A basket of spoiled food was left at their doorstep. Rotten fruit, moldy bread, the stench of decay rising into the morning air. It wasn't a gift. It was a message. A warning of how quickly life could rot when one was denied dignity. Later, at the market, the protagonist reached for a loaf of bread, only to have the baker snatch it back. "Not for you," he said, coldly, his eyes shifting to the watching crowd. His tone wasn't just rejection, it was performance. He wanted others to see. He wanted to make cruelty public, a lesson for all. The protagonist turned away, empty-handed, as whispers rippled through the crowd. They could feel the stares, sharp as knives. Hunger gnawed at their stomach, but humiliation gnawed deeper. At night, they dreamed of fire, the same dream, again and again, flames rising from the edges of town, devouring everything, shadows of faceless people dancing in the glow, chanting words they could not understand. And in the middle of it all, the protagonist stood, frozen, unable to scream. They would wake in the dark, drenched in sweat, gasping for air. And always, outside, the town slept peacefully, or pretended to. The dreams felt less like nightmares and more like warnings. Days blurred, each more suffocating than the last. What had once been individual acts of cruelty now became collective. A bucket of water accidentally spilled across their path. A shutter slammed in their face. Even children, emboldened by their parents' silence, began to throw stones and taunt them in the street. But what hurt the most wasn't the stones. It wasn't the insults. It was the realization that there was nowhere to run. No place in this town, no corner of the square, no shadow of the church where they could exist without being reminded that they were unwanted. The town had become a cage, and every person in it held the key. Yet even in this suffocating cruelty, something began to shift inside the protagonist. The pain did not crush them. It sharpened them. They began to watch more carefully, their eyes tracing the movements of those around them. They noticed who spoke, who laughed, who stayed silent. They began to see the patterns, the way hatred spread like wildfire. And in that observation, a thought began to form. If they are preparing for me, then I must prepare for them. It was a dangerous thought, one that carried both risk and power, but it refused to leave. It grew stronger with each humiliation, each betrayal. The silence of survival was over. The The storm was coming. The air itself felt different now. Heavy, charged. The town no longer whispered. It spoke openly, its cruelty, unmasked. Where once hatred had hidden in shadows, now it paraded in daylight, bold and unashamed. The protagonist could feel it with every glance, every smirk cast their way. People no longer bothered to lower their voices. The insult became greeting. The shove became ritual. The laughter became weapon. It was no longer individuals acting out of malice. It was the community itself, unified in its contempt. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, the protagonist returned home to find the door ajar. Their heart lurched. They had locked it that morning. They always locked it. Slowly, they pushed the door open. Inside, the house was wrecked. Shelves overturned. Clothes torn and scattered. The table split in two, as though struck with an axe. And on the wall, scrawled in jagged letters, were the words, "You don't belong here." The message was written in ash, dark and smudged, as if pulled straight from a fire. The smell lingered, not just of destruction, but of warning. This wasn't theft. Nothing of value was taken. This was invasion, violation, a message carved into the very heart of their safety. The protagonists sank to their knees, the weight of betrayal pressing down. Home had always been the last sanctuary, the one place where the world could not touch them. Now even that was gone. The next day, whispers turned into action. At the marketplace, a crowd gathered, not for trade, not for festival, but for spectacle. The protagonist was shoved into the circle, their body colliding with hard stone. Faces loomed above them, some twisted in anger, others in mocking delight. A stone flew, then another. Each strike echoed louder, not just in sound, but in meaning. And yet, what hurt more than the stones themselves were the faces. Familiar faces. The woman who once shared bread, the man who once nodded in greeting, even the children, laughing with cruel innocence, mimicking their parents. The betrayal was complete. That night, the protagonist sat by the shattered door, too weary to close it. The darkness pressed in, but it was not as heavy as the darkness inside their chest. They thought of leaving. They thought of running far away, where the cruelty of this place could never reach. But deep down, they knew running would not erase the truth. Racism was not just in this town. It was in the bones of the land itself. Wherever they went, it would follow. And so, something hardened inside them. They would not run. Not yet. The storm was not only approaching, it was here. And when it broke, the world would no longer pretend to be silent. By the time the church bells tolled the next morning, the protagonist understood. Survival was no longer a matter of silence or endurance. It was war, and war always demanded sacrifice. The town had chosen its moment. One night, under the cold gaze of the moon, they came, torches in hand, voices raised, not whispers anymore, shouts, chants, demands. The protagonist was dragged into the square. No trial, no reason, just accusation born of hatred. The crowd swelled, hungry for blood disguised as justice. Faces once familiar were now unrecognizable, twisted by rage and fear. Every eye screamed the same verdict. Guilty for existing. They tried to speak, tried to defend, to plead, but the noise drowned them out. Stones, shoves, a blow that split skin, another that forced them to their knees. The air filled with smoke, with fire, with violence. In that moment, clarity struck. This wasn't about a single act, a single crime, a single life. This was centuries of hatred, sharpened into one night of terror. The protagonist lifted their head, blood streaking their face, and met the crowd's gaze. For the first time, they did not look away. Fear was gone. Only defiance remained. And as the first torch was hurled forward, flames rising into the night, one truth echoed louder than the mob's roar. They were killing not just a person, but the very idea of justice itself. The fire died slowly. Smoke lingered, curling into the sky as though carrying away the last breath of justice. The square was empty now. The mob scattered back into their homes, leaving only ashes and silence behind. But silence has a voice. It whispered of guilt, of complicity, of truths no one wanted to face. Some who had raised their fists now avoided each other's eyes, haunted by the memory of what they had done. Yet others felt nothing, only the cold satisfaction of power. And that was the most terrifying truth of all. Injustice didn't end with the act. It lived on in the hearts of those who accepted it. The protagonist's life was gone, but their defiance, those final unbroken eyes staring back at the mob, remained like a curse, a mirror none could escape. And so, the story does not end here. Because every time hate is allowed to roar unchecked, every time fear disguises itself as justice, another square fills, another life is silenced. The question is no longer what happened then. The question is, when it happens again, will you remain in the crowd or will you stand against it?